Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible and fantastic episode, just like always. And today we're going to be talking about Hurricane Helene. Not Helen or Helena, but Helene. And we're going to be discussing its impact, how it is Kamala's Katrina, obviously by the title, and answering a few questions about that. So today we're going to start off with all questions. All the topics we're going to have are Cognitive Elite questions. So I will begin my pitch for the Cognitive Elite. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. So the first question comes from none other than K-Max. K-Max is asking about the hurricane's impacts. He says, Scott, this hurricane in North Carolina has led to a feeling that our elites actively wish us to leave us for dead while paying for foreign wars and illegal immigrants. Your view of this is more incompetence or evil when Bush had his Katrina wall-to-wall media coverage attacking Bush. With this response, it is crickets or defense of the response. And he talks about an R.I. McIntyre tweet saying that they want you dead, and the response is because they genuinely hate the people of North Carolina. So we'll go on to this, and then we'll be discussing how this relates to Katrina, and then the online rights response to it. So it is, I have to say, this is the second deadliest hurricane of the century besides Katrina. The death toll is nearly 300. It's likely to rise up even higher. They haven't recovered all the bodies yet. And that's an extremely high amount of Americans to die from a natural disaster. You know, they generally think anything that's like kills, a dozen or more people is horrifying. But when you have hundreds dead, that's a big problem. And it's also Katrina killed nearly 2,000. The official death toll is 1,800 or so. And that's a lot. And, and the feeling in America is that it is outrageous to have a death toll of 100 or more. We're supposed to be protected by these natural disasters. We're the most advanced country on earth. There should be an immediate response to protect people and to save people's lives. And the fact that the federal government is failing in this, and it seems that the entire western North Carolina is completely wiped out. I-40, one of the major interstates of this country, that section that goes through western North Carolina is going to be out of commission for indefinitely. They've announced it. It's like they're not going to be having it and that's going to cause tons of problems throughout the rest of the year. That's a major highway to get to for holiday travel, and we still have that coming up for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Also going to be problems with transportation and transporting goods, and just the devastation it's going to have on people's lives. Transportation and communication is completely destroyed in Western North Carolina. It's not just Western North Carolina. It's all throughout Southern Appalachia. And that's, and Eastern Tennessee is also devastated, northern Georgia, parts of Virginia. This is a storm that really hurt Trump country. And when we see the lack of a aggressive response, you see the news, they didn't really cover it that much. Now they're covering it simply to attack the misinformation from Republicans. And there's this half-assed response from Kamala to the crisis. And Kamala visits, and it also really demonstrates the weaknesses of Kamala. As she's out there and she's just looking, annoyed she's there. She's, showing her complete lack of charm. There's the horrible, horrible video of her, in a way, packing supplies in an utterly contemptuous way. It is such a joke they thought this would be it. She's like, zipping up a Ziploc bag, and it's done in just like the most unpassionate way possible. It's showing that she has no common touch to actually relate to people. They always criticize Trump for going to Puerto Rico and throwing paper towels like they were basketballs, shooting them to the crowd. But that's like, the people were enjoying that. They were riled up. They were showing that this guy had the common touch. Like, Trump knows people. Trump knows how to interact with crowds and to get them on his side. And it's whenever you see him out and among people, whether it was him visiting East Palestine, it's not Palestine, it's Palestine, East Palestine in Ohio, where he went to the fast food restaurants and interacted with the people. These people are suffering a massive devastation and disaster. And they were just thrilled that Trump was there and shaking hands. And he knew he has that common touch. He knows how to bring cheer and good spirits to people and inspire people that, like, hey, someone is here to help you. Kamala, it's obviously not that. If any person, with their house completely washed away and, them being homeless and them seeing the vice president, just dejectedly, in her very awkward way, zipping up a Ziploc bag, you're just going to be like, this is the complete opposite of a response that I want. Like, this is not inspiring me. This is, pissing me off. And that image is something that they could just use. It's like the federal government just doesn't care. They're just going through the motions. And that's all that Kamala is doing. Like, Kamala could not give a speech to people who are devastated by the hurricane and appeal to them and make them feel that everything's going to be taken care of and everything's going to be okay. Trump can do that. Trump has that ability. He's proven that time and time again. Now, there's questions about the political impact, but I want to go to answering the question that K-Max stressed. Is this due to evil, that they're intentionally ethnically cleansing Western North Carolina, or is this due to incompetence? I would say it's quite evil. It's primarily incompetence, but it's also how they stress which areas they care about. These are sparsely populated areas. These are not, Asheville is the biggest major metropolitan area affected, are directly impacted by this. Parts of Charlotte were also hurt, were also impacted. Most of Charlotte wasn't, but there was like a certain area of it that suffered major flooding. Primarily the city is Asheville. Everywhere else, it's not a populated area. This is different from Katrina, which hit on a major American city, and also that major American city is majority black, and they can be like, oh, Bush is racist for not. Bush doesn't care about black people, as Kanye infamously said, and he was Kanye at the time, so we are not dead naming him. There's people who will be like, you can't call him Kanye, it's Ye. I prefer calling him Kanye. And in any case, and he was called Kanye at the time. And that New Orleans, these aren't supposed to happen in major cities. There's been tons of devastating natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods that have happened to less populated areas. Southern Appalachia is one of the more thinly populated areas in America. It's also why, when these horrible tornadoes happen in the Great Plains, there's minimal attention paid to them. And it shouldn't happen because sometimes you'll have higher fatalities and there'll be more devastation than would have happened on the East Coast. But they generally only care about disasters that happen on the coast or to a major city. It's even the hurricane that happened in, I think it was 2017 or 2018, that completely flooded Houston. One, they wanted to focus on that because they could blame Trump. Two, it was a major city. It's the same with the hurricane that devastated Puerto Rico during Trump's time. They could attack Trump with this. Here, media doesn't want to focus on it because they don't want to hurt Biden and Kamala. Mainly, they don't want to hurt Kamala. And if they focus in on this hurricane and show how the federal government is completely bungling the situation, then that'll hurt Kamala's chances of winning election. Obviously, they don't want to do that. And yeah, these people are Trump voters. They're rural whites. They're not going to generate as much sympathy among liberals as would blacks, Hispanics, people living in cities are. Rural whites are just not. So do they intentionally want this hurricane to kill them? I wouldn't say so. We have another question about this, which I'll get to right after K-Max's question and talking about how it's similar to Katrina and other things. There's now the attempts that it's a weather control machine was responsible, and it's not just random people on Twitter. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Marjorie Taylor Greene wasn't just an offhand comment. she continues to repeat this. She has said this both from her personal account and her congressional account that they can control the weather. And Mayorkas used the weather control machine to intentionally go after Trump supporting areas. And I'm going to say that's insane. I'm going to be a cuck and I say I don't believe that. There's also just some wild stuff that they're like doing a land grab. Why are they doing a land grab in Western North Carolina? You know, the federal government is not that interested in that territory. You know, if it was like a suburb and they're wanting to build Section 8 housing, I would, you know, maybe there could be a theory for this, but like they're not going to build massive condominiums in middle of Western North in like a sparsely populated part of Western North Carolina. There's not even the money there. It's like it's not there. This is not prime. This isn't quite prime real estate. There's some more retirement. There is a lot more retirees moving to that southern Appalachia, both eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. But, I'm going to not believe that conspiracy theory. I think what's true here is that the federal government spent so much money on migrants, and they've spent so much money on these foreign wars, both in Ukraine and in Israel, is that they have no money left over for us. And I think the general points that the right is making are true. Is that one, this response is a disaster in of itself, and due to their bungling, they are letting people suffer and die. That is true. And if they wanted to blame Katrina and Bush, and they wanted to blame the hurricane that struck Puerto Rico. I mean, they want to complain about false disinformation here. They were trying to claim that Trump used a weather machine to intentionally genocide Puerto Ricans back when he was president. Okay, I remember the type of coverage. They had this on CNN and MSNBC, and they would bring up, I think it was the mayor of San Juan, who is this horrible Latina, and she'd go on there, thick action, she'd like, Trump is trying to kill us, and it's like, and then the CNN was like, oh, that's so true, and they'd spread the biggest bullshit about this, and this wasn't just repeated on right-wing Twitter or anonymous accounts. This was CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times. They were spreading the worst bullshit about Puerto Rico. They weren't even, it was even worse than what they had spread about Katrina, where in Katrina they were like, he's trying to commit a genocide against blacks. He wasn't. And then even with the hurricane that struck Houston, they were trying to say that this is intentionally like Trump is trying to kill off Houstonians. And they were constantly trying to find ways to blame. And now when this is clearly a failure on FEMA and the federal government and the Biden administration, and they don't have enough money to have a proper disaster relief because they've been blowing all this money on migrants, and Mayorkas has even admitted this, and on foreign wars, and now they want to say this is the most incredible hurricane response in human history, and also the real problem is misinformation. I'm going to talk about some of the misinformation later on, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is the federal government response, and they have failed here. And they have failed here because of their priorities. And they're giving less money to the people devastated by this hurricane than they are giving to migrants. And so I think the general gist of what the right is saying about this, it is true. And generally, it's based in fact. It's based on a correct interpretation of this disaster and how the federal government prioritizes different groups. The federal government clearly cares more about migrants than they do rural whites. That's 100% true. Are they trying to kill them? No. One is I have a difference, which this is beyond the podcast, is I don't think that they don't feel as threatened as by these groups in Appalachia as I think our side thinks they're threatened. They don't like them, but they don't view them as much of a threat as I think a lot of our side wants to believe that they threaten, or that the regime is threatened by them. But they simply they have other priorities. And those other priorities are Haitians, Venezuelans, Ukrainians, Israelis, not Western North Carolinians. And that's a fact. So Some people maybe go a little bit bombastic and over the top, but I think they're coming. The general meaning and gist is correct. I would say it's more incompetence than direct evil. Even if this had happened to an area that they would have cared about, say Atlanta, they'd still have a bungled response. It'd still be I mean, they would. The media would have a harder time ignoring it or pretending that it's the greatest response in human history, like they're doing with Helene in Western North Carolina. But they would still, it would be bungled because this is an incompetent administration and they've blown all their money on foreigners, both migrants and people in Ukraine, Israel, and elsewhere. They've blown all their money on foreigners. And they simply just don't give a shit about a sparsely populated area. So it's less direct evil. It's more that they just don't care, which is almost as bad, in my opinion. And it's also incompetent. So it's a combination of the two. And they also know the media's on their side because the media's out there saying like, "Oh, Kamala, this is one of the most impactful things. She really showed her common human touch." And you can just look at these videos and you're like, what the fuck are you watching? This is obviously the horrible political PR here. So I will go with that. I think it's important to bring up how the media treated Trump's disaster responses, both with the Puerto Rican hurricane and Houston in comparison, particularly the one in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of things about the Trump administration that people have forgotten because the media coverage was so insane that the media is embarrassed by it. And this is one of the times, how they covered COVID is forgotten because they don't want to show how hysteric they were. But CNN and MSNBC had death trackers. Most people remember this. And they would have guests on there that saying Trump is responsible for genocide, that he's intentionally killing every single person who has died from COVID in America, is that Trump is responsible and he's committing an intentional genocide. And they would have these people on cable news. So, and that's way crazier than any of the things that people are claiming about Hurricane Helene. The weather control machine is less insane than claiming Trump is committing a genocide through his COVID policies. And then they were also claiming that about Hurricane Maria that struck Puerto Rico in 2018. The mayor, who I said, the horrible San Juan mayor, I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce her name. She said that he killed the thousands of people on Puerto Rico. He did not. He is directly responsible that he killed these people. And I'm reading this article not from, some crazy left-wing website. It's an interview she did with CNN. And the host is like, "Oh, this is so true. I can't believe this." And this is like insane that they were, and this is what the mainstream media was promoting. And this is far crazier than that. And the thing with Puerto Rico is that this was the direct response, and similar with Katrina, this was the direct responsibility of the local officials. Puerto Rico is a third world country that's an American territory. They're completely incompetent. They're totally corrupt. They had no preparation for a hurricane. They get struck by hurricanes all the time, and they get wiped out. And it's also far away from the U.S. Mainland, so it's tough to get supplies there if it's like all wiped out. But it was wiped out, and then they were mismanaging all this money and funds and resources that they already had, and then they were completely dependent on the federal government to come to their aid. And then Trump did this, and they were just like, "Oh, this is a good way to attack Trump." And so the San Juan mayor, knowing she now was a star and that they loved to promote these random people who would attack Trump. It's like when Michael Avenatti, who was Stormy Daniels' lawyer, who then went to jail for other crimes and was a complete scumbag, they turned him into a star for a year or so, and they weren't talking about him running for the Democratic nomination. That's how insane it was. And so they found this mayor to just say Trump's committing a genocide against Puerto Ricans. He intentionally killed all these people. And the entire mainstream media was promoting these ideas, and they're completely ridiculous. They sort of did this with Houston, the hurricane before, the year before in 2017, but it didn't quite work. And also Greg Abbott was there, and they tried to blame Republicans, but this is the game plan. And this was just a more insane response than what they did in Katrina. And Katrina really crippled the Bush administration and their popularity. It's not remembered that well because it's a lot of people have short memories and don't remember things that happened 20 years ago, and it is now 20 years ago. It was 19 years ago. It was 2000 in August of 2005. But that really did hurt Republicans and Bush, and something they couldn't recover from. It was Iraq and Katrina. And Katrina was the only thing the media talked about for over a month. I was a teenager at the time, so I could remember it. And what happened in Katrina is that, he had just come off a presidential election win where he won the popular vote. It's the only time Republicans have won popular vote in the presidential election this century. It's the only time that they've won it since 1988, actually. So the only time they've won it in 36 years. We're going to see Trump might win it, the popular vote in 2024. And he came off and he was starting to have his popularity diminish, and it had already been diminishing by the Iraq War. But, the economy was really good. This was pre-recession, pre-Great Recession. So at a lot of things, there's a lot of optimism around. And then Katrina hits. And there's wall-to-wall coverage of this. And they were reporting that there might be tens of thousands who had died. And there was all these wild tales that were being reported, related in the media about like them just seeing, hundreds and hundreds of bodies floating around New Orleans. And it was like a horrible devastation. And then there was the Superdome where it's like, all these people are trapped there and this like terrible response and they didn't get out. And then they had the governor, who was a Democrat woman. I think it's Governor Landrieu. I don't think it was Landrieu. It was another Democratic woman. So it was the sister of Mitch Landrieu. I think that was somebody else. And then they had the mayor, who was a black guy, who were all there on the media, and they were ready to claim that Bush is a racist and did this because he hates black people, and to apply it. And then there was Kanye out there to say that George W. Bush doesn't care about black people, which George Bush in his memoirs said was the lowest moment of his presidency. It wasn't anything to do with the hundreds of Americans coming back in body bags from Iraq, or that he had lied to the American public to get them into Iraq, or his idiotic economic policies that caused the Great Recession that was designed to create more minority home ownership. No, it was simply a rapper saying he doesn't care about black people. That was his lowest moment, which showed you everything about how terrible Bush is. It's like, you kill all these great Americans for a war you lied to get people into, and that's not the lowest moment. And this war just went complete shit show. You cared about some random rapper saying you didn't care about black people on national TV. And that was his lowest moment, because he's like, I care about black people. And so they were, and the media knew that this weak point, and they drove it home, and they complained about the FEMA response, where he went to the FEMA director and was like, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie. And that was all used to kneecap the administration. And Republicans, despite having a strong economy, they were wiped out in the midterms next year, and Katrina played a major role. And it was due to the fact that people in all these states, and Louisiana was still a battleground state at this time. There was weird battlegrounds. Like, there were way more battleground states where potentially a Democrat could win in there. I mean, by the time of the 2010s, it was obviously no longer a battleground state, but it was a state that a Democrat governor. It just had one, but I don't think they're going to have one for a very long time. It was a much more competitive state, and a lot of these other states were much more competitive than they are now. States are way more locked into a partisan affiliation now than they were in the 2000s. And that's a different story, or that's a completely different subject. But those midterms reflected this public turn on Bush. And it's not simply, the party out of power generally does better in midterms. But if you looked at the situation, the economy's going great. The issues for Bush were Iraq and Katrina. And both of those were used to cripple the GOP and create a historic win for the Democrats that year. So that really did hurt him. And I think this is why it can be Kamala's Katrina's. That some people are claiming, well, the areas that are most affected are Republican, and it's going to make them harder to vote. Yes, that is true, but it's also the fact that that whole region is paying close attention to this. This is the biggest news story in that region, and this includes 2 battleground states and 1 state that could be a battleground. I don't think Trump's going to win Virginia. I think it's going to be a lot closer than it was in 2020. I think it might even be closer than in 2016, where he only lost the state by 5 points. He could lose the state by 1 or 2 points. If he wins Virginia, he won the race. So I would be very white-pilled if they announce, early on, and they're still counting the votes in, the Rust Belt, and he wins Virginia. You can go to bed knowing Trump won. There had to be the most insane steal ever possible if he somehow won Virginia but lost the presidential election. In any case, this includes 2 direct battleground states and a potential battleground state, especially in North Carolina. And North Carolina, this is all local news that we're going to be talking about for this entire month, and people are going to be early voting. People are going to be thinking about who they're voting, and they're going to be seeing the federal response from Biden-Harris administration. They're going to see the horrible optics of Kamala trying to show she helps and cares, and they're going to be running ads about that, and it's going to be deep into people's minds. And yes, this is going to impact some people in Western North Carolina being able to vote, but it's not just Western North Carolina paying attention. It's the entire state. And there's going to be a lot of undecided voters who are going to see this and conclude that Kamala just is a complete incompetent who they do not want in a time of crisis. And this is also going to have an impact on Georgia, because Georgia's also been impacted. And they're seeing this, as well. And I think, and if you see how Katrina played out for Bush, obviously different scenario because the media was opposed to Bush while they're playing defense for Kamala and Biden. But still, people are going to get the real message. They're going to see that this is a bungled response, that they left Western North Carolina devastated, and all they can offer is platitudes and complaining about Republican misinformation. And this is going to dissuade people from wanting to vote for them. And so I think the more likely scenario, which runs counter to what a lot of right-wing Twitter does, because, they really love fear-mongering and hyperbole. I think and this shouldn't be the most important matter, but if you're going to want to know about what the political costs or consequences of this, I think this helps Trump. This helps Trump, especially in 2 battleground states and potentially a 3rd. And people are going to see that, and people are seeing this. It's not quite the same extent as Katrina, but people are still noticing. It's not like they completely ignore it and all the people are buying the bullshit fed by them, by the media and the administration. They're going to see through the lies. And they can see through them through social media and what they're hearing from people in Western North Carolina and the areas devastated by this. So I think it's going to actually help Trump in the election. That is my view of it. And that's why I think it's going to turn into Kamala's Katrina. Now, if she does win North Carolina, then I am wrong. If you see that there was incredibly low turnout in Western North Carolina, and that's the whole reason that Trump lost, then maybe right-wing Twitter is correct on this. But you have to remember, these are sparsely populated areas. These are not, except for Asheville, which is deep blue, but it's surrounded by red. The suburbs are very important, and they're very red. But these are not the most populated areas of North Carolina, and he can't depend entirely on Western North Carolina. But if he somehow loses North Carolina, which I always predicted he would win, the main problem I thought might be Robinson drags him down. But I think Robinson is going to be out of out of people's attention for North Carolina. Robinson's still going to lose. They're going to be focusing on the hurricane response and how the feds have bungled it, and they're going to blame Kamala. So now I'm going to bring up right-wing Twitter's response to the disaster, which I want to note, like, I think they're generally in the right direction on this. I'm blaming the feds and Kamala and saying that they don't care about these people. They care about foreigners more than they do. I think it's all true. I think generally the federal response has been is a disaster for a disaster. So I'm not criticizing that, but they have gotten a little stupid. Are probably very stupid. But I have a question about this, and this comes from Preston. He says, you talk a lot about the insane clown party, but there is also a phenomenon of an insane clown. Is there also a phenomenon of the insane clown dissident right? Accounts on Twitter that just engagement bait, post demoralization content, and spread retarded conspiracy theories. Guys like Stu Peters would be an example. How much of a threat does this pose to the greater dissident rights goals, and is this a side effect of the expansion of free speech on X that still makes Elon Musk's purchase of the platform worth it? I don't know about the threat it poses. I think it's more of just a problem. You don't want to be idiotic and like trying to scam people in engagement bait. And a lot of people cannot resist the desired engagement bait over this hurricane. And it is part of the free speech of expansion of X. The positive of that completely outweighs the negative, but it's still worth bringing up the negatives, and because it can make it. We do want to avoid being totally stupid and totally grifting and scamming, which the content farming is out of control. I've talked about this a lot, but it's definitely out of control when there's ever a disaster. I remember when the ship collided with the bridge in Baltimore, and everyone rushed to their own conspiracy theory about it with who they wanted to blame. You know, it went from the Chinese, CIA, cartels, Israel, Islamic jihadists, and it was like coming from people who have absolutely no fucking idea of what happened. You know, they didn't even realize that there was a bridge there, and then they just immediately did that, and they would get like 10,000 likes, and they'd get increase the revenue share. So people are just doing that for money. It's also the ad revenue sharing has also encouraged this, is because people, if you post the most hyperbolic content, you're gonna get the most likes and engagement, and thus you're gonna get a bigger paycheck at the end of every pay cycle. So people, they're incentivized to be idiotic, and generally that's the content that does best. So people are just making up stuff about the hurricane that, you know, they're just like, I heard that they're now lynching FEMA officials. It's like, I don't think that's happening. I don't think, and also you should be careful about encouraging this stuff. But people have like, they feel like there's consequence free, so they'll just like encourage this stuff. And it's like, I do worry about the fake information getting to these people actually suffering from the disaster, because it might make them consider stupid decisions. They think that FEMA official, if they approach and they're going to shoot them in the back of the head because just some guy's engagement farming and they're trying to get more money in their Twitter paycheck, then I think that's wrong and that's disgusting to do. And that's why I'm not really into this, because I know many of these people are thankfully without internet, at least from seeing Twitter and getting, even they're making their situation even worse and being paranoid that like FEMA officials are going to shoot them in the head or throw them in concentration camp or take their property, which is what which is what a lot of right-wing Twitter is trying to convince them of, because they want the money and they want the likes, and so they're just making up stuff in order to do so. And there is like a lot of misinformation out there. I don't want to sound like totally cucked about this, but yeah, there's a lot of misinformation, and I don't know, like, I would like to know what's going on like on the ground, and I know that I've concluded that I cannot get accurate information either from the mainstream media, which once presented as the greatest disaster response in human history, and then on Twitter they're rounding up all the survivors and putting them in a prison camp, and they're taking their land away, and and if anyone wants to try to help, they arrest them, and you know, they take them to a black site or something. You know, I don't know what's true here. And I think you have to doubt all the material, the source material that you're seeing. So I don't really like that, but it's encouraged by the nature of Elon X. I think Elon X is still mostly a positive because we're able to break through and get out a lot of information that we would have otherwise not done so before. And I'm wanting to say that X becoming a fully right-wing platform will help us in the election. Now, if Republicans lose in November, then I think the benefit of free speech X is diminished. I think it turns out that actually normal people are not seeing this content at all, and then we're all just talking to ourselves and amusing ourselves. And a lot of the people who are on there are actually foreigners who can't even vote, which I've seen this a lot. If you'll see like a lot of content, it's like we're waking people up to this, and then you look at the well, they no longer have the likes, but you can see with the retweets and the people replying, and it's like Abdul, Mohammed, and they're speaking in broken English, and like I don't think these are American voters, but you know, it happens, and there's tons of Indians on there now too, but it's still mostly a positive. But you know, if we win, I could say that Elon Twitter helped. But if we lose, then I think it's the value of it is diminished. There's still a value to it, but the value that we have it can be exaggerated. But I think we're going to win, so I'm going to say that the value is still worth it. So I don't know. It's how much of a threat? You know, it does dissuade smart people from getting into this stuff. If you see like major people and they're wanting to say, I wonder what these people are saying, and they're talking about a weather control machine, that is so stupid. Any person who's like, that is idiotic. It is completely brain dead to believe that. And that's just going to a step further from, you know, talking, they're spending all this money on migrants. They're so incompetent they can't get local rescuers involved, you know, people with the material to do this. And, you know, I understand that. But then like the weather control machine, like any person with an IQ over 100 and it's not completely, you know, plugged in the online right, is going to think you're an idiot and a moron. But people cannot resist this stuff, and people don't want to counter signal it because it's like, well, maybe there is a weather control machine. You don't want to be a cock to you, and so people will continue to encourage this stuff, and they don't want to counter signal, and we generally are left with like the dumbest people imaginable controlling the discourse. So we have flat earthers, weather control machine people, you know, people who think the Ukraine war is fake. I remember that was like a big thing in 2023. I don't think they believe that anymore. But, you know, Damar Hamlin body double like theories, like these are all things you're like forced to believe just for audience engagement. And also you're encouraged to believe because the ad revenue sharing. But I don't think it's, you do lose smart people with that. And so I think it does pose some threat. We're still winning over smart people, and they ignore this stuff. But a lot of the material we produce is for the hardcore audience and to rile them up and to entertain them and amuse them, rather than thinking of like, how can we build a message that would win over sympathetic normies or people outside offline. And instead of doing that, we then focus on creating the most hyperbolic bullshit possible just to get more revenue from Twitter. And I think it's a negative incentive structure that I would say. And I don't know if I would call the insane clown dissident right, because it's more just the nature of online right. I don't know if it's just the nature of content farmers, and content farmers, they don't really have a political ideology. It's just whatever gets the most engagement. I saw one that was like really stupid where it's like, most people don't know they burned down the White House. One word, not two words, in War of 1812. And this all shows that everything's a federal op. And it had like 10,000 likes. And it was like, clearly the guy was done by a foreigner who had just gone on Wikipedia and whatever and found something. And especially the fact that White House is one word. You know, it's clearly two words, and most Americans know this. So yeah, I think it is a problem, but the positive of free speech Twitter outweighs it. But it's still worth noting, and I wish there was more people. I think it would be better if people focused on the smarter aspects and not the weather control machine and flat Earth. Which, if you're just going to engage in this stuff, yeah, you're going to get a huge audience for it. You're going to get money, and there's a lot of stupid people looking to be entertained. And even when I talk to people who are like flat Earth, it's like, well, I think this is a lot funnier than believing in the science, so I'm going to believe in it. And it's not like they're questioning the regime. It's just more that they want to be entertained. And and people are like, we're waking up people and we're making them question everything. But really questioning everything, they're just trying to amuse themselves and they're blowing off steam after a day of work or whatever. It's more like a violent video game, like Grand Theft Auto, and how they interact with right-wing Twitter or social media, than in some way that they're having some political radicalization or they're being radicalized into action or being educated into thoughtful action. Instead, they're just like, oh man, this is awesome, flat Earth, great meme, weather control machine, they totally believe that dude, and they're like smoking weed and whatever. And does that change anything about how they lead their lives? No, they're still smoking weed. They're still gonna marry some Filipina. they're still listening to rap music and stuff. It's not creating any type of awakening. There's just some like form of entertainment they have from their busy day of work or whatever. But I don't want to blackpill too much. I think it's still positive, and I think the general gist of what right wing is trying to set on this catastrophe is generally correct, and the blame lies squarely on the Biden-Harris administration. And so they're directionally right. They're just getting a little too exaggerating and hyperbole in order to content farm. But it's tricky. I wouldn't do this on Twitter because I don't want to sound like I'm saying the FEMA response is great. It's not. And you have to pick and choose which is bullshit. So I'm just like, retweet the stuff I clearly know is true. Retweet the lines that are clearly know that true. Like they've blown all this money on migrants and have no money for real Americans. That's true. That's the most you can do. But I think that's going to be communicated the most to normal voters, and that's what the Trump campaign is communicating to. They're not talking about the weather control machine. Marjorie Taylor Greene, it is bad because then the Democrats can exploit that to say this is what Republicans are trying to tell people. A random anonymous Twitter account saying that, it's whatever. But a congresswoman repeating it and her being a close Trump ally, that creates problems because then they can just say, oh, they're trying to blame a weather control machine. These people are complete maniacs and insane people. Vote for the Democrats who you can trust for a situation like this. They're the adults. But I think most people see that their response is beyond comprehension and is terrible, and they're not going to actually support Kamala over this hurricane response. So that's my thoughts on the hurricane. And now moving on to other economy questions. So Dollar Bill has sent 3 questions, so we will answer those questions. His first question is, will millennials age into becoming the new boomers? I think a defining trait of the boomers is they are extremely gullible and easily deceived into believing things that aren't true. See libtard boomers believing America is full of racist cops who hunt black people for sport, and conservative boomers embracing QAnon. Probably because all the references to Q let them easily imagine their characters in a Bond movie. Senior citizen millennials may be just as gullible, but with much less money to spend on boomer luxuries like RVs, vacation condos in Florida to spend the winter, and mail-order brides from the Philippines to be wife number 3. Millennials are going to be something completely different. It will have a completely different culture, and there will be a very different generational interactions and relationships between millennials and the younger folk than it will be between boomers and millennials and boomers and zoomers. Boomers, really, the thing is that most of them, or the perception of them, is that they made it. They existed in America where it's much easier to achieve the middle class dream, where a college degree was an actual ticket to the middle class, where they could afford a home, where they could, work a standard white-collar job that didn't require them to work that much, and they'd still have enough for a nice pension and retirement fund to go to Florida. All these things are possible, which millennials are just not going to have. Millennials are going to have less money saved up. They're not going to have as great of pensions, and there's going to be higher cost of living for this stuff, and they're also not going to have as many kids. A lot of them are going to be single. A lot of the men are just not going to make it to senior citizenhood, because I think the suicide rate is going to be bad. I have an article coming up about this. I'm probably going to post this tomorrow, about warning about the childless cat men, because I've heard people like say, oh, the childless cat men are really worse than the childless cat ladies. Actually, they're responsible for this, and we need to attack them more, which is just stupid. It's that the childless men demographic is be really pathetic, because a lot of these guys are going to be ones dying from deaths of despair, that they're, drinking themselves to death, or they're actually, directly killing themselves for this. And I think there's going to be, I think the deaths of despair, they show that the numbers were declining a little bit, but I think they're going to increase when millennials are entering middle age. They don't have kids, they don't have a wife, they have a shitty job, they don't have a real retirement plan. I think you're going to see it's really spike. And so you're really going to have, it's going to be overwhelmingly female for senior citizen millennials. And it's going to be a lopsided female to male ratio, in my opinion, or at least higher than for boomers. And a lot of them are just not going to have kids, far more than boomers. And a lot of them are probably not going to have the financial security of boomers. And that's going to be an insane demographic, which will be driving a lot of our politics. And it's going to be something different than boomers. It's going to be very female oriented. Instead of them remembering the, classic rock and the Rolling Stones and Leonard Skinner, they're all going to be talking about how awesome Taylor Swift is and Ariana Grande. It's like very female pop artists of the 2010s and 2020s that they're going to be remembering. And I don't know how that's fully going to play out. I think they're going to be more left wing than senior citizen boomers. They're going to be a lot more miserable. I think they're going to be more prone to political radicalization and extremism. I'm sounding like a political scientist here, but some of the political radicalism will be good. I don't know, probably open to conspiracy theories as much as boomers, but it's just going to be a completely different thing. I don't think there's going to be as much of resentment towards them and that they've hogged all the wealth that there is with boomers, because they're just not going to have as much wealth. Everyone hates millennials, though. Even millennials hate millennials. Like, millennials all want to deny that they're millennials. It's like the worst thing you can be in our society. Millennials all want to either claim they're Gen Xers or Zoomers. Like, there'll be 30-year-old guys who will be like, I actually am more of a Zoomer. No, you're fucking not. You are a millennial. Be proud of being a millennial. I'm like the one person who will admit that they're a millennial. And I'm not a Gen Xer. I'm not a Zoomer. And all the millennials, even when they start to have kids, they're like, I've transcended millennial status. No, you're a millennial. But everyone hates millennials. Boomers hate millennials. Gen Xers hate millennials. Zoomers hate millennials. And Gen Xers will think that Zoomers are awesome and the most base thing generation. A lot of right wingers will do that while also hating the young, but then they'll think that that's a millennial aspect. They have a schizophrenic attitude towards the young. And then boomers just hate all young people. And then Zoomers hate millennials for being cringe, whatever. So it's not so much resentment. It's more just hatred, because resentment is saying that they have something that you don't have. But a lot of millennials are just not going to have that. They're not going to have the type of wealth. They're not going to be hoarding the wealth that boomers are with our society. So there's not going to be this type of envy for millennials. It's going to just be more like you suck type of aspect towards them. So I'm going to predict that they're going to be more insane, and it's going to be much more female driven than a lot of the crazy stuff we've seen with senior citizen boomers. And where they're going to be living is interesting. I don't think they're going to be like retiring to Margaritaville in Florida and the villages. I think a lot of them are just not going to have the ability to. There might be more around us than boomers are, where they all move to retirement areas. I think a lot of them will just, they'll, if they ever bought a home, they're going to hold on to that home until they die, which even a lot of boomers are doing. So it's interesting. It's hard to say. I think it's more of a picture to see of senior citizen Gen Xers who are now, Gen Xers, depending on where you mark them, they are about to turn 60, the oldest ones among them. If you mark them, I think the way we mark the generations is stupid, but that's another thing. They're about to hit 60, and so we're seeing more of a picture of how they are acting in middle age and how they will act as senior citizens. Mostly they will be similar to boomers, just fewer kids. Maybe they still have a lot of wealth. They still, all of them mostly had established themselves pre-Great Recession. They bought homes and were able to have a nice middle-class job. Some of them may have had problems in middle age and getting laid off, maybe more than boomers, but probably will be the same as boomers. It's really going to be millennials where I think it'll be a completely different picture. Also, millennials are going to be more diverse, so there's that. I was just going to say they're going to be more insane, as they're going to have fewer family, fewer friends, less wealth, realizing their time is coming to an end, and that's going to lead to some serious issues. So moving on to dollar bills, other questions. His second question: when the Ukraine war broke out, Ukraine mania swept the country. You had people flying the Ukrainian flag outside their home and putting it on their social media profile pictures. I remember browsing a liquor store and they were selling a craft beer with anti-Putin art on the label. How was the gay able to so effectively mobilize public opinion in supporting Ukraine? I know that people are naturally inclined to support the underdog in a fight, but I think there's more to it than that. The Dems created Russiagate to dispute the 2016 election, to rationalize Hillary's defeat, and delegitimize Trump's presidency. But even before that, liberals were pissed off with Russia passing a law banning spreading LGBT ideology to children. I remember there were protests around this for the 2014 Winter Olympics. When Clinton bombed Serbia in 1999 to support the Kosovo Albanians, nobody was flying Kosovo flags or brewing anti-Milosevic beer. I think the difference is, one, some of it is that they've been hyped up to hate Russia. And also they were able to tie Russia to domestic enemies, mainly Trump, mainly white people. And they could say this is everything bad. And anti-vaxxers. So all the great enemies of liberals were able to turn into Russia. I think it's also that America, this was like the last hurrah for hyper-politicized America. And also COVID brain. Is that COVID really destroyed people's brains? I think this shouldn't be news to most of my audience, but it's just something worth repeating. And you could see them just adopt all this idiotic stuff throughout COVID. The COVID maximalist, the BLM, all this stuff. They were able to just generate mass hysteria over so many issues around this time. And also this had already been building up during the Trump years, where they would make them care about, like, as I said, the Puerto Rican hurricane, which everyone now forgets. Him saying shithole countries, that generated protests. There's also the women's marches where millions of people, primarily women, were marching around the country. And this feeling and sentiment was still around. The COVID restrictions were still in place. They still had mask mandates everywhere. They still had vaccine mandates. It only ended when people were like, wait a minute, all these guys are dying in trenches and they're not masked and they're not practicing social distancing. And also Democrats were realizing this is hurting us politically to maintain this stuff, so we ended it. But that also allowed people to come out from COVID brain and to be less hyper-politicized and to focus on other things like sports betting and OnlyFans and vacations and stuff like that. And so they became less politicized. But this was really the last hurrah of it. Because you can see of it as we had let up on the COVID restrictions prior to them overturning Roe v. Wade. And I thought there was some aggressive protests, and there were threats against the Supreme Court justices, and there were some pro-life centers that were attacked, but it wasn't quite as bad as it would have been if they had overturned it in 2021, because people were still like, really in a distraught state over COVID restrictions. They were still very hyper politicized. But once those restrictions were letting up, people began focusing on other things besides politics, and they began taking down the Ukraine flags and forgetting that they had ever made their whole social media profile dedicated to Ukraine. And so the response to Roe v. Wade being overturned, it was reflected in the ballot box, but it wasn't reflected in so much like social media went up in arms, and there was mass protests everywhere, and then it even led to terrorism wave. It was not as grand and dramatic as you would have thought, considering the events that have been leading up to it. So that's something to keep in mind. So I think the reason why there was this outpouring of just insane levels of normies getting opt into being extremely pro-Ukraine was that it happened at the perfect moment for that. With, people are still really online at this point and still very much focused on politics because, there's still the COVID restrictions in place. They've been psyopped by BLM and also COVID, obviously. So people's brains were perfectly suited for this. Also, it had the perfect enemy of Russia, and they're an aggressor, and they're evil, they're white nationalist autocracy, and they're the perfect villain for American empire to condemn and to show as the ultimate enemy, as the new Hitler. So there's that. I mean, another difference between Serbia and Albania, or Kosovo, is that Serbia is a bit player. They're not nobody cared about Serbia. I mean, Serbia is not that important of a country. Russia is a major power. And, Americans generally distrust Russia. We've never really liked Russia. There's been people like, oh, Russia backed the Union during the Civil War. And they primarily did this because they thought the British were too friendly to the Confederacy, and they saw that actually a breakup of America might benefit British foreign policy, and Britain was their primary enemy at the time, their geopolitical foe, and that's why they backed the Union. But there was no real shared admiration between them. America really thought that Russia was a backward despotism that had a autocratic government, but then it was a real autocratic government, and then Russians saw Americans as like this a godforsaken land where they don't have proper order and everything. So there was never America and Russia really only liked each other during World War II. That's like the only time that there was ever warm relations, and I don't think the right really likes that. So they're suited as a perfect enemy, and they were able to pitch the Ukrainians as a plucky, underdogs that that would be suited for America. But it just happened at the right moment. If the invasion had happened now, it wouldn't generate the type of mass enthusiasm that it would have then. You can even see this with Israel thing. It's really more these specific populations that deeply, deeply care about Israel issue. They are getting this to Zoomers in a way just because of TikTok, and a lot of their favorite content creators are very interested in conflict. But it's not generating as much hyper interest as Ukraine did in 2022, at least in the spring of 2022, as people are just moved on to focus on other things. And, I think, and even with the Zoomers who are getting into it, I think it's just more like hashtag, free Palestine, or most of the Zoomers are getting more on the Palestine side than the Israel side. But it's more of that, like the type of thing that millennials used to say is slacktivism, and not the full on, I'm going to fly a Palestinian flag, or I'm going to fly an Israeli flag, like they were with flying Ukrainian flags. I mean, you could go, it wasn't even just Washington, D.C. There was auto dealerships in Texas, in red Texas, that were flying Ukrainian flags. That same enthusiasm didn't even happen among Israel, among the Gaza war. So you can see that that's like changed there. Now you could say that one thing with Gaza war is that there are more, that the public opinion is more divided on that than with Ukraine. Even though on right wing Twitter is mostly pro Russia, even though that's, I think, dissipated for good reason. Among the general public, overwhelmingly pro Ukraine, and they did polls of this. It was like there would only be like less than 5% of the public had any sympathy for Russia's side. There was a general high percentage of like, I think like 20%, or I think it was even less than that, who were just like don't care, don't know enough. But then it was like over 80%. I think maybe in some polls it was like 90% supported Ukraine. And over 80% said we need to give them a blank check to give them all the weaponry possible. Much more divided on Israel Palestine. Sometimes it's like 50-50 depending on how the question's asked. Sometimes it's even more sympathetic for Palestine. Well, our government's obviously clearly on the Israel side. So it's a much more complicated picture. But I think even then, even though it's more evenly divided, there's less interest and fixation on it than there was with Ukraine when it first started. And it just happened at the right moment. You know, October 2023 is, it's now a year anniversary of it. Completely different America from spring of 2022, in large part due to the COVID restrictions being lifted. And then that there was a shift in public consciousness and how the public acted following that. So that's my answer to that question. I think it is just that particular moment when it happened, spring of 2022, winter. I say spring, it's happened in February, but it was late winter 2022 into the spring. That was a very particular moment. It was like the last hurrah of hyper-politicized America. Still reeling from BLM, still reeling over people still wanting to defend CRT. There's still the COVID restrictions. But then it began lifted, and I think after the midterms, you began to see, and also social media changing at that time. Social media was censoring pro-Russia stuff and banning it. Then Elon took over Twitter, and it shifted, and social media shifted in a different direction. A lot of changes, and then you could see a completely different response a year and a half later towards the Gaza war on October 7th, which still had a lot of interest, but people were not basing their identities around it in a way that they were with the Ukraine war. And I think it just showed America was in a very different spot than it was in early 2022. So that's my answer on that. And his final question from Dollar Bill is, the IQ supplement you did last year on horror movies is one of my favorites. In it, you mentioned you may do another episode on the subject, possibly focused on a specific movie or franchise. Now that the spooky month of October is here, are we in for a spine-tingling follow-up that will both terrify and inform the Greer head community? I really wanted to do one on the Halloween series, but it depends on whether I watch the Halloween series. I have a lot of IQ supplements due this year. Also, we have an election cycle. I've had requests to do one on the 2016 election. There's other things I have planned that deal with stuff. It's not the best time to do it this year because we have a presidential election leading up. It would be better to wait till next year to do another horror movie one because it's an off-year election, so always going to be caring about 2025 elections that are going to be coming up. So I have more time to just focus on that. But we might. If it did happen, it would be 2 weeks from now. I guess that would be the 24th that we'd have one in the Halloween series. Maybe is my answer. But I would like to do one, but it'd have to be how many Halloween movies I watch. I can literally do a whole really in-depth IQ supplement on the Halloween series and slashers. Maybe if I read a slasher book There's a couple of books on slasher movies, so I'll try to find one. And if I read it, I could do something on that, and with a particular focus on Halloween and the lore and canon about it. So maybe is my answer. We will do it someday. It might not be this year. If it's not done this year, I promise we will do one next year. Highly Respected will not end after the election. We'll be continuing going stronger than ever into 2025. So that is my promise to you. Now we've got a final question from New England Refugee. If I did not answer your question, it was for the mailbag. If I did not respond to you, just send me an email. Once again, I always double or triple check sometimes the inbox in other ways. Not everything comes up as they should. But please, if I did not respond to your question, just say, look forward to answering it for the mailbag. But anyway, New England Refugees, final question. It recently broke that Doug Emhoff slapped his ex before Kamala. They were drunk at the Cannes Film Festival, and when trying to bribe a cabbie, Doug's ex touched the cabbie's shoulder. Doug spun around and gave her the old honeymooners treatment. Besides film sounding very white trash, what are your thoughts on this, and will it have any effect on the election? Probably not. I mean, the Doug Emhoff, the media is good about keeping the families, the trashy, scummy behavior of the family from impacting the actual candidate. I mean, look at Hunter Biden for 2020. And Hunter Biden, his actions were much more directly impacting Joe because he was getting all this money on behalf of all these foreign interests and all these companies because he could influence Joe Biden. And that's like a serious political issue. Like Doug Emhoff slapping his ex in a cab doesn't really impact how Kamala will be president. It's the same with him knocking up his nanny and other things. And they're still presenting him as like, you're the new type of man. You're redefining masculinity, which his redefining masculinity is pretty funny. It's like you slap women, you're begging the nanny. It's like, you could almost say he's demonstrating a kind of Chad behavior. I don't want to defend it. I mean, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying there is a meme value to it. There is something funny that he's redefining masculinity, and it's like, well, he is in some ways. But no, I don't think, because it doesn't directly impact how Kamala will govern. And I'm not saying this like a cuck perspective. Hunter Biden should have impacted the election. It should have made it clear, like, hey, this family's wildly corrupt. Anyone can pay Hunter Biden to make sure he can buy crack, and then they'll have the ear of Joe Biden that, hey, this should impact the vote. And media censorship made it not impacted. I think if the Hunter Biden laptop had been leaked a month earlier, and if it had not focused in on all of his dick pics, and also if there had not been as much media censorship, that it would have 100% ensured Trump won. Now I don't, it's not going to have an impact. It's more of like, well, Kamala, like, why did you marry this guy? It's more of domestic issues, which people are just like, oh, well, people get drunk, whatever. It doesn't really impact how Kamala will be president. Now, if Doug Emhoff was taking a bunch of money from Chinese interest because he could say, I can lobby Kamala, like it was happening with Hunter, then that would be something to impact the election. But I think his trashy behavior and his scumbag behavior is not going to impact the election. It is funny, though, that he's like being seen as redefining masculinity because there's like, oh, he's a nice beta male. And actually, he's not. He's he's like the complete opposite. He's like the nightmare image of what a man is for feminists and liberals. But he's able to convey himself as like, oh, I'm a nice feminist man. I'm the second gentleman. I support my wife. She wears the pants in the family. And then, if Kamala began hitting on a cabbie, that's where the real Doug Emhoff comes out. So I don't know. It's something funny. It's more humorous on that element, but that's not going to impact the election. So that is it for Highly Respected this week. We've got more great content coming up. Later this week, we'll have 2 columns. I actually need to correct myself. I said the 24th, that could be the potential Halloween episode. I am mistaken. I got my dates wrong. That would be the 25th. I had to double check my calendar. So that would be Friday, October 25th. And that would actually be 2 weeks from now. I think I said a week from now. We're not that close. October is here. I'm getting my all dates mixed up. So there'd be people like, what are you talking about? Just had to clarify. But anyway, in any case, we're still going to have great content later this week. Great IQ supplement and more great stuff for you guys to look forward to. So until next time, stay respected.